So for today's webinar, we have presentations from Josie Chambers, Marja Spierenburg, and Tobias Haller lined up. But before we get to that part, I would like to kick off the meeting with a seemingly simple question, which references the title of this webinar, Engaging in Meaningful Co-Productive Practices for Sustainability. And the question that I wanted to start this meeting with is, what is meaningful co-production? And especially a special emphasis on the term meaningful. I guess it's something that sounds nice, but perhaps it's not so obvious what it really encapsulates. I'm gonna put the question in the chat. I have sub-questions that maybe try to address different points that we could explore in this first short discussion on what constitutes meaningful co-production. And I'd like everyone to participate to this first discussion. And I see that Tobias has joined us. Hi, Tobias.
Oh, sorry for being late. We had another meeting, but now I'm in.
Welcome. Glad you made it. So, yeah, if you want if anyone of you wants to tackle this or start tackling this this first question on what constitutes meaningful co-production, please go ahead, raise your hand. Also, feel free to comment in the chat if you don't feel comfortable taking the floor. Perhaps I can turn to our speakers today to maybe get us started on this topic. Josie, would you be able to give us your take on what constitutes meaningful co-production?
Yeah, sure. First of all, hi, everyone. It's really nice to see everyone here. Yeah, I think it's a hard question to kind of distill down into a small response. But I think for me, a few critical things are that there's no single answer to this question of what is meaningful, that it's really important to embrace a plurality of different approaches in co-production and recognizing the potential value and limitations of that diversity. And for me, I'm especially interested in approaches to co-production that are really sensitive to power and politics, so that have an explicit goal towards social environmental justice and really kind of prioritize, have a kind of that subversive, transgressive dimension of actually trying to challenge and shift power relations through their approach. But of course, there are many different ways I think that co-production can play a meaningful role in that. And so for that, I feel there are kind of two important parts. One is who actually has the power in co-production processes. And I've seen way too often that it's very common for whoever gets the funding or has more power to frame a lot of the questions or the approach in advance and then try to get other people on board within that frame. And I guess I'm really interested in how to more genuinely share power in that co-design process. Which means very different things depending on who is involved in the power dynamics at play. And then for the second thing, I would say it's much more meaningful when you have enough space for critical reflection and for people to really challenge their assumptions and engage in deep learning, but also not get too stuck in that side. So also to actually take action and not just have co-production be an exercise within a dialogue space or within the knowledge production side of a research project, but to actually work together to create changes and to find kind of a balance between those two modalities. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that because we've got a lot to talk about, I'm sure, and a lot of people to hear from.
Great, thanks, Josie. Tobias, perhaps you have also a particular take on this?
Yes, I mean, for me, it's specifically of interest to understand what are these power relations Josie was talking about. So I think there's the importance to take quite some time in order to understand what different actors mean in this context, what they mean by, certain words, certain processes, how these come about, how we are labeled or label each other in this context. And I think that's really important. So for me, before starting with co-production, I think we need to know more about each other in this context, also to understand the power relations, how they work. it's one thing to address power relations, but it's the other really to understand how they sort of look like. And of course, for me as a social anthropologist, this fieldwork has taught me that it takes a lot of time. Even when I think I know where I am, a new twist comes up. And having said this, I think it's the issue of a process and letting actually some space for that process. I think that's really important. That sounds perhaps a bit, very, very general, but going into a context, the first thing is really trying to understand what's happening, and also how are you labeled or perceived as an actor in this context, even though you think you're neutral, etc. So that is actually my take and my plaidoyer, so to speak, for giving more time in this process before something starts.
Right. Thanks, Tobias. I see that Jamila has made a comment in the chat about co-production being about meaning making, and so producing or eliciting plural and diverse meanings as something that I guess is quite literally meaningful. Jamila, I don't know if you would be able to perhaps expand on that.
Thanks. I don't want to take away from looking forward to hear from the speakers. It was just a bit of a play on words, but also working on, just creating that meaningful space in that deepest sense of the word of what. And I think there's just often a lot of tension as well about what is meaningful to some actors might not be to others. So within a joint co-production process, finding that joint meaning together, but at the same time also acknowledging and appreciating and holding in tension the diverse meanings that different actors are getting out of that. So it was just provoked by the meaningful co-production, I guess, to dive deeper into what this meaning making actually means and how we study that.
Thanks, Jamila.
Looking forward. Thanks.
Maybe Marja, I would like to invite you now to react to that initial question.
Yeah, I also saw Jamila's remark, and I think that is really a very a valuable part of the co-creation process, but it also makes it very complicated, and it also means that the jump from co-production to from co-production of knowledge to action may not be that straightforward. And I fully agree with Tobias that actually it does take a lot of time. And there's often this assumption by funders that you can do co-creation in an afternoon by just inviting some of the main stakeholders and then you have your project. Whereas in fact, you do need to have an insight in local power relations before you can set up that process. And of course, most of us develop proposals for places that we have been working in for a long time, so we have some insights, but it is very important to have that, because otherwise, your second sub question, who decides on the meaningfulness of co-production, that will be a very limited and very dominant group that may very well sideline other very valuable meanings and knowledges as well. So for me, that's a very important part.
Thank you, Marja. Are there any other comments or questions, perhaps additional questions to that initial discussion on meaningful co-production? No?
No, just...
Yes, please go ahead. Sorry, I probably missed I don't know if you have your hand raised, but I didn't see it. Apologies.
No, sorry, it's just to add up of the previous reflections, that the fact that it's not, the question addressed not only co-production, but also meaningful co-production. And as one of the previous participants mentioned, what is meaningful is really relative, and it's absolutely crossed by social power relationships. So it's a very hard one to tackle, just that, because what is meaningful from the scientific perspective or from the funding's organization perspective may not be meaningful at all for a small community, or even if you change the scale, what's meaningful at the local level may not be I don't know if relevant, but maybe not so easy to achieve when you escalate it to a regional or national level. So that's it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And the last sub question on does meaningful necessarily mean impactful in terms of sustainability kind of alludes to that a little bit. It's just I guess one version of what you were describing in broader terms. The fact that, yeah, depending on your perspective, you might see it as meaningful where others might not. So yeah, I think one thing that's we've managed to make clear already at the start is that there's something very, very political about co-production, and it's something that is also a lot about reassessing values and interests. This is the kind of like the deep learning exploration or the critical reflections that Josie was mentioning as well, and the time that it takes to kind of explore those power relations in order to arrive at something that could be considered meaningful co-production is also essential. And I think that all those themes sort of foreshadow what is going to be presented in just a minute. I just have I don't know, I haven't seen the presentations yet, but I'm just guessing. And so I suggest that if I'm trying to catch up with comments in the chat, but I see that there are no additional questions. There was a comment about whether co-creation is the same as co-production. And Marja, you indicated that they're often used interchangeably. If everyone's okay with it, then yeah. So in that case, I suggest that we now move on to the presentations part of this webinar. And for the first presentations, I would like to invite Josie to go ahead and share your screen, if you can.
Yes, just 1 second. Okay, can everyone see this slide? Okay.
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I thought I thought I could give at least a little bit of an overview into this paper and this idea around co-productive agility, because Tobias Haller and Marja Spierenburg, we actually all work together on this project. So we've been working together now for several years. So the idea is that I'll give a bit of an entry point into our work and approach. And then you'll hear some more kind of in-depth case-related perspectives, and also kind of some of their higher-level ideas from both Marja and Tobias. And just to give a very brief overview of what we did together, we came together back in 2017, and we realized that all of us, so all of these authors that I just showed, we were all engaged in co-production processes, trying to stitch together knowledge making from often quite diverse disciplines. So most spanned over 4 disciplines. And then also working across many different sectors that were trying to actually create different kinds of action to address social environmental challenges. And it's just this huge black box that even in the chat, someone asked kind of what's the difference between co-creation and co-production? And we were asking these same questions in terms of our differences in terminology, in framing, in method, in the types of outcomes that we intend, and what actually happens as a result. And these were you can see these were projects that were very locally oriented in the kind of the pink indicator, all the way up to very kind of global dialogue scales, all bringing people together in very different ways. And interestingly, across all these projects, we found that there was at least a bias among our group of 2/3 of them were led by more than 50% women, which we thought was quite interesting. So we did this analysis, which I'm not going to go into all of the details of that, because then that would be my entire time. but it extended over several years, starting in 2017 with 2 participatory workshops in Mexico and the US. And then kind of this long process of analyzing all these different cases, seeing what was coming out, coming back together, examining those results in a participatory way, analyzing again. And so it's just a really fascinating process to learn from so many different types of approaches. And it led to these 2 different papers, one that identified 6 modes of co-production that we found across our 32 different initiatives, which all pointed towards different purposes for co-production. So they all had a different type of value that they could bring, but also really important pitfalls that we became more aware of through the project. But what I'll focus on briefly now in my limited time is on this second paper that came out within the past year on co-productive agility. And so I hope to kind of give you at least a small window into this, but then hopefully we can go into further detail afterwards. And so what we, as kind of the focus of this webinar also shows, we were really interested in these different tensions or conflicts that pop up or appear in these co-production processes, and the importance of how we manage that for what actually results, and whether we see certain types of transformation and for whom and by whom. And so there were 2 different tensions that we especially chose to focus on in this paper. And it might actually be interesting on your own. I don't know if you have paper in front of you, but to kind of like draw out these axes yourself to see your positionality in terms of what you tend to prioritize. Because what we saw is we did this definitely links to what we were just talking about with meaning making, because we saw that some projects, they wanted to really define what that meaning was, what that goal is, what kind of action they're striving for, and then really kind of solution oriented, and then bring others on board. So really kind of focused on creating solutions and action. And other projects were really focused on kind of picking apart dominant solutions or dominant ways of doing things and critiquing that and showing why that's problematic. And many were also very much trying to juggle these 2 dualities. And so it was interesting to see how the projects, there seemed to be kind of a tension between these processes, but many projects showed the value of really navigating these different purposes for both creating divergent spaces to open up critical reflection, but then also to force yourself to take collective action and experiment and see what actually happens. And then we did see also a difference between projects that tended to keep a lot of control over their decisions and over the framing from the get-go and also throughout the co-production process. And on the flip side, projects where researchers, for example, or other kinds of societal actors who obtained money completely then kind of threw over the problem framing or the approach to certain societal actors that they wanted to have a greater say in defining that process. And again, we did see quite a bit of a tension, but really a value of finding the middle ground between people bringing in their own perspectives, but also creating a lot of space for other perspectives and navigating those different meanings. And I realized, and so with this kind of, with these tensions, we realized there were different kind of archetypes or approaches that were emerging across, that were also kind of present even in different actors in different cases, but also in general approaches. And so we labeled these as 4 different archetypes, which if you're familiar with the paper, you might have already seen. And the first one we called kind of this hero archetype or hero modality, in the sense that there's a lot of control over saying, this is the goal that co-production should achieve. We need to solve a certain issue. And this is the kind of process, or these are the people that are going to help contribute to that. And I realized in reflection that a lot of my, I guess my early scientific work was actually very much in this modality. So when I did research, I used to research primates actually with different NGOs and community groups. And it was very much in this modality of, we're lacking knowledge on species distribution and feeding patterns. And so we need to go and collect this knowledge in a collaborative fashion. And then that will somehow contribute to environmental helping to address environmental issues. And so I suppose kind of over my career, I've kind of, not only in this project, but also this led me to reflect back on my career of kind of the limitations also of these different modalities. Because on the other side, we have the woodpecker, which kind of also keeps a lot of control over the project framing, but also then takes a more critical stance. And that was really the approach in my PhD when I looked at different interventions that were trying to conserve nature and support communities in the Peruvian Amazon. And I was kind of really uncovering all of this knowledge of why are projects failing, and how can they potentially be better. But it was very much from I had complete control over that original project framing, and I kind of brought people into that framing that had a political ecology background, but wasn't really, I guess, relinquishing much control or framing to other actors to play a role. Which meant that when I was hoping to kind of share the findings, I hadn't really thought through the importance of how that knowledge, how that political ecology knowledge is actually produced, and the involvement of different people to actually generate or have a kind of an impact in that setting. And so that led me to kind of more of the host modality, which we found also in this research of trying to create kind of space for learning and reframing. So not so solutions focused, but really about making space for many different perspectives to come in. And so linked to that project, then I was focused more on designing dialogue spaces where different perspectives could come in. But then also kind of fell into the trap of what Tobias and Marja were talking about, of just how difficult it is to understand and navigate all of these different power relations that are present, which we also saw in a lot of our projects, and also the dangers of kind of having an echo chamber if it's only about reframing and learning and not tied to people's actual interests of the kind of action that they're invested in and the meaning that they want to be making. And then finally, this genie side of not being necessarily kind of the hero who's setting in the agenda, but throwing over the agenda to others to set it. And I noticed this in my postdoc work at Wageningen when we were looking at different ways that researchers, so 71 researchers, were connecting their research to transformative change. And this bias, or this quote, shows kind of the frustration that people felt. So on the one hand, they would be accused of being a genie researcher if they were supporting community groups that were grassroots groups that were fighting for social justice. But then on the other hand, people would also be accused of, in a corporate setting, of just simply taking the corporate question that was thrown at Wageningen researchers, answering it and feeding that knowledge back, that also that's relinquishing too much power and really has that pitfall. And so this is just a quote from someone saying, we're accused of being biased, yet if I was doing work with a corporation that's reinforcing particular narratives around trade, then somehow that isn't seem to be biased. But of course, in both cases, you're kind of relinquishing the power or control over setting the research frame and question to someone else, with a lot of kind of important implications depending on the power behind that. So this was the kind of the overarching frame, and we noticed kind of some of the different pitfalls or downsides of not then balancing the perspectives of and designing a process that's more agile in navigating from the more critical, the more solution oriented, and the power of different actors. And so just to kind of show this through a metaphor, because this was something that we produced as part of the paper, we actually we put each of these different actors into a different musical instrument line to kind of show the dangers of when you don't question the hero effectively and you just always start with that notion of what the problem is, that you can just kind of reinforce that voice and just get kind of polarized or exacerbated tensions between those who don't agree and those who want to promote their version of the solution. And that also the kind of suppressed tensions, because those who take on that genie role are only kind of supporting or furthering the hero, or creating spaces like multi-stakeholder platforms that aren't really creating genuine spaces to explore those tensions in a safe enough way. And so we I'm just going to kind of quickly show the metaphor of what we turned each of these characters into. So the first one we turn the hero into a singing loop where the problem and the solution are reinforcing each other.
Problem, solve it, ooh, solve it, ooh, solve it, yeah, problem, solve it, ooh, solve it, ooh, solve it, yeah, problem.
And then I'll add the genie bass line that's furthering that loop and kind of strengthening it without questioning it. And then for the woodpecker, we actually took the hero kind of singing narrative of this loop, and we electronically distorted it to create some tension and kind of dissonance with that initial hero loop. And so throughout the song, you can kind of hear this tension between both the woodpecker and hero.
Ooh. Ooh.
And then for the host, we thought that's kind of the like the percussion or what's setting the tone for how these different actors are interacting. So that's more. So if I play them all together, I'm just going to play a very short snippet of how it all comes together. You'll hear that hero narrative is just kind of furthering, and while the woodpecker is trying to question it, it's not actually really leading to any possibilities for transformation. And so through this musical metaphor, of course, kind of in parallel to the paper process in question of what does co-productive agility look like, we were asking that also in music of what does it mean actually for these different actors to be much more responsive to each other and embrace not just that dominant loop, but actually open up space for more kinds of dissonances, different unexpected directions in the song. So kind of as a metaphor for this co-productive agility of what does it sound like to have this collective willingness and ability to iterate, to iteratively navigate different meanings that are coming into tension, so that you're not just coming in with your meaning and coming out with the same meaning, but you're actually being open to and navigating different perspectives. And so I'll play kind of where we came to that in music, very briefly, a short clip, and then I'll show actually an example of what that looked like in our cases to finish off. And so for an actual case, because I realize the music can be a bit abstract to figure out kind of what exactly that means in a co-production context. But to highlight just one example of that, one of our 32 cases was focused on the island of Barra, Scotland, on restoring marine conservation. And in that setting, the government had mandated marine protected areas off the coast of this island. And they came in with their maps based very much on ecological and biological values, a very static map. And that created this whole dispute between communities and government that really led to kind of a polarized situation and not many possibilities forward. And so together with the communities, an artist and a social scientist, so this is the work of Ruth Brennan back from 2018, and they actually gathered different perspectives, so all sorts of ways of exploring different values and expressing them in much more creative forms, such as stories and songs. And they created this completely alternative, dynamic multimedia map of the area that was a completely different way of portraying people's relationships to the sea. And it led to showing that also back to the government, led to kind of reframed notions of what the role of people is actually in the problem before they were seen as kind of part of the problem. And this helped reframe and make those values actually much more visible to help enable a direction forwards in part of a co-management process to actually reshape the trust relationships and the types of the institutional space that was set up. So that shows kind of one example of how co-production practices really helped not just, for example, go with the kind of the state's hero approach of coming in with their map and their solution, but also not just going, taking the genie scientist role of just supporting the communities with what they wanted, but really kind of navigated this space in between and used techniques to really reflect and kind of surface different values and perspectives on the reflection side, but also put that into action in terms of reshaping practices and relationships and institutions fundamentally as a part of that co-production process. And so this is the kind of the overview figure. And there are kind of 4 different pathways that we identified in terms of decisions that people make and how they design these co-production processes, from more focused on elevating marginalized agendas to questioning dominant agendas, and then to navigating conflicting agendas. So really around like within decision-making processes, to kind of removed from that political context where you're kind of more openly exploring diverse agendas without that decision-making pressure. And if you go to the paper, you can see all sorts of details, which I do not have time to go into now, but it really goes through kind of key moments in those design processes and shows you real examples from all across these 32 case studies. And if you want further details that of kind of how you could bring this concept into your teaching or into a co-management process or a co-production process, then there's also a practical guide, and I'll put these links in the chat. And you can follow up there, and there's all sorts of exercises, including like a role play that uses these archetypes. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll put the links in the chat. And yeah, really curious to hear more also about everyone's questions whenever we get there and other people's work.
Thank you very much, Josie, for this presentation with some very innovative ways of illustrating your main arguments through music. We do have a few minutes for questions, so now would be a perfectly good time if you have any questions for Josie. I do not see everyone, so if you're only raising your hand physically, you might need to take the floor because I do not see you. No questions?
Perhaps
Yes.
I would have a question.
Go ahead, Tobias.
Josie, through the process also of making the paper, I was always also thinking of how these 4 archetypes sort of engage with each other, you know, in a process. You try to show this with the music. You also try to show that sometimes then there are mistones between the four archetypes. Did you see from the cases any sort of pattern how this sort of interacts? Is it often that we start with the hero and then things turn to be difficult and then we have other archetypes coming in, or how is this interaction also in a, let's say, in a more historical process to be perceived?
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. That's a really interesting question. And I think in many of the cases, almost people were quite responsive to other roles that people were stepping into. So if you did get a kind of very strong hero figures coming in, then that might provoke a very strong woodpecker response in people who don't, who kind of problematize that claiming of power and meaning and space. But of course, sometimes those people are completely outside of the co-production process. So it really depends. And then when you do have those tensions within a project, I think if people take those stronger standpoints, it can be very difficult to actually create kind of the openness for people to really genuinely listen to each other and to play kind of more of that host role. So I think the host role is really challenging to do that in a way that doesn't become apolitical, because I think a lot of the cases where that host role was well developed, there was really a danger also of just kind of assuming too much that if you bring the perspectives together, that's enough, not really attending to the power relationships up front. And yeah, also only kind of inviting people into the space that want to come into the space, who are more open to that very vague purpose. I think it was always challenging for those kinds of projects to get kind of the higher profile or people who are quite busy and have their very fixed agendas that they care about, to get them into that space that was very vague and didn't necessarily say, yes, we are definitely going to speak to what you care about. And then at the same time, I think projects were very valuable that created these smaller subspaces that really then could bridge between what people cared about and kind of bring them in a direction that kind of bridged with some of the concerns of the project, to then slowly kind of bring these spaces together in a way that's much more intentional in terms of the design. But yeah, I think also interesting how people and projects would move into different spaces throughout the lifetime of a project or the lifetime of their career, as I also noticed with myself, and kind of the struggle to actually not only work in terms of the language of these archetypes, but really ask like what's in the middle, what does that look like? And so in that practical guide I share, there's also an exercise that invites people to think about what is that archetype that kind of goes beyond, it is more agile in the middle, where they kind of create their own character and can also kind of let go a bit the terminology of these 4 archetypes.
Thank you, Josie. Are there any other questions? Yes, I see that Florencia has a question. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yes, I was wondering, I thank you very much for the presentation. That was really original. I really liked it. And I also read the paper, which I really liked also. And I was wondering, because these 4 archetypes that are precisely archetypes, but I was wondering if there's, because when you were explaining the process, or at least your own process, going like from one archetype to another, I couldn't help wondering, as an anthropologist, if you have also reflected on the figure of the mediator, because are all the members on a co-production project that in general are very large projects with very different disciplines and countries involved, and in all this complexity, how would the mediator figure could relate to these archetypes? I couldn't help reflecting about that. I don't know if you already went in that direction or not.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. And yeah, I'm not sure if I am familiar with the exact framing of what you're talking about, but taking in kind of this mediator role, I do think that it's very difficult to have a co-production process that really navigates between these different meanings in a sensitive way, that's not giving too much power to those who already claim more power from the outset, without having some kind of mediator role. And I think that's often been quite difficult to do, because within academia, we have focused so much on knowledge production, knowledge generation, that the frame is often, the hero frame, if you will, is often so fixed around lack of knowledge. Therefore, we need to create knowledge. And we're not necessarily rewarded as much for all of that extra mediation work that it might take to set up these kinds of processes. And then similarly in a professional field outside of academia, there's often so much pressure to be in that solution mode and deliver the project, that it can be difficult to kind of connect to the kind of the critical and reflection side that academia might bring. So I think it's really important that we carve out more of these mediator spaces. And I have been seeing more both institutionally, but also within certain university environments, much more space for that recently. So I think that's an interesting trend to try to also build on, to acknowledge the importance of creating space for that. And also that not everyone can do everything. I think that's also important, is figuring out there are different roles and figuring out who can bring in these different components and how that mediator, if you're not good at that skill, how can you bring that in?
Great. I see that there's 2 questions lined up. So perhaps so there's one in the chat. Frank was asking if you could perhaps briefly explain why you decided to use a musical abstract. And then I see that Florina has a question. So maybe Florina, you can go ahead, and then Josie, you can answer both questions back to back.
Yeah, so big thanks also from my side. I liked a lot, not just listening to your talk, but also to the music. I have a question regarding I did not know that you also have a practical guideline, so I found this very interesting to think about if we could also use it, for example, in teaching. So I already used your 4 pathways for with experienced researchers to reflect about our own project. So I was wondering, do you have experiences using your approach with, let's say, students who don't have a lot of knowledge on what co-production is or own research experiences? So what's your experience with working with different type of people with your pathways as a reflection tool?
Yeah, thanks so much, Florina, for your question. Yeah, I have used it. So some of those in the practical guide, those exercises I have used in teaching for teaching purposes. And I found it very valuable I use a role play where I actually present that same Scottish case that I showed with the protected area community dispute. And I have the students actually step into roles, real life roles that fit kind of the hero perspective, the woodpecker, and I kind of force them into a rigid situation where they have to kind of navigate in a project meeting and try to figure out something to do jointly. And it's super, super difficult, not only because it's a pressure cooker time-wise, but they have to kind of embrace these roles that actually make their lives more difficult. And so then once they have we debrief what was it about the situation and the roles that made the exploration of the tension so tricky, and then open up for discussion of how that can be different and the importance of designing spaces and the kinds of roles that you take on that actually helps to navigate tensions in a way that's more open and doesn't lead to either the suppression or this exacerbation of tensions. And so I think actually being a part of that, taking on that role and being a part of that experience is really helpful for students to kind of see that firsthand. And there are definitely other exercises that might be useful as well. And then for the music question, yeah, explain the use of, yeah, it's definitely an unusual way of communicating it. It kind of came because I've been involved in music for a long time, and I always felt that it was weird that I've separated completely my music and creative practice from the research practice that I do. And so also kind of in the spirit of co-production, of trying to figure out how to intersect these different practices. And does that lead to kind of new combinations or ways of making meaning? That led me to reach out to an old friend of mine when I was based in Cambridge, who I used to play music with. And so together, I just called Noor up, my friend Noor, and I said, oh, I've got this idea. I would love to explore this paper in musical terms. And then we had a series of conversations that was super fascinating of thinking about, okay, well, what would the hero sound like? What would and he said, actually, Josie, you make the hero, and then I'll be the genie. So he was actually the genie coming in and adding the bass line. And then it was actually funny. We really had to be quite agile in our perspectives of designing this thing, because I almost messed it up by, I kind of like made a suggestion that would have, if he had gone with it, then it would have really ruined the song. So the fact that I was kind of listening to his critique and his perspectives, and we really came to it together. was also, I think, an illustration of that co-productive agility itself. And we said there are a lot of parallels between also being an improv musician and having to listen to and kind of think about how to respond and add to, but also move beyond what you're hearing. There are a lot of parallels between that and how we might take on this mediator or this facilitative role in dialogues. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Josie. That's fascinating. So now we can probably move on to our second presentation for today. And I would like to invite Marja Spierenburg to come and step forward.
Yes. And Gilles, can you manage my PowerPoint presentation because the screen sharing didn't work?
Still doesn't work. Okay, I'm gonna try a little trick, and you let me know if it works. Share screen.
Yeah, it works. But I will have to ask you to change the slide.
No problem.
Well, thanks for the invitation. And I was one of the people together with Tobias to work on the paper with Josie, bringing in some of my, and critically looking at some of my own research experiences, which was a great process. I work at the University of Leiden, and I've also posted my email on this slide so that you also have a way of contacting me. Can I have the next slide, please? And well, looking at who everyone in this virtual room, I don't think I have to explain to you what makes sustainability problems complicated to work with. They are wicked problems, and there are what makes it even more difficult, and also which is a huge challenge for co-production or co-creation exercises, is that we often do see a lot of cross-scale linkages and trade-offs and synergies. Take the simple example of the e-bike and the e-car, which would be great to reduce our carbon footprints in the global north. But it results, the batteries need a lot of precious minerals that are found in countries, often involve displacement of people from mining, pollution, in some cases also because we don't want to pay too much for our e-bikes and e-cars, results in the fueling of civil wars, for instance, in the Congo Republic, where a lot of these minerals are found. And so these are cross-scale linkages that that can be probably studied from a place-based perspective, looking at how certain problems manifest themselves in local places and how they're connected to different scales. But taking these into account in co-production is really, really difficult. There have been some attempts by working with global marine organizations, for instance, fish multinationals active in fishing, to improve marine conservation, but it's really difficult. Can I have the next slide, please? At the same time, of course, the fact that these problems are so complicated sort of seems to really call for inter and even transdisciplinary collaboration. And it also makes sense to work directly as researchers, but also as policymakers with those who experience the trouble, as Donna Haraway refers to it, firsthand. And that sort of realization is further fueled by, well, it has also dawned on funders. And so, most of the bigger research funders now actually require transdisciplinarity. So not only researchers not only working across scientific disciplines, but also with stakeholders. scientists increasingly are supposed to have a societal impact, but also want to have a societal impact. I mean, most of us are doing this kind of research because we care about sustainability. But as Josie already mentioned in her presentation, is that we are often sort of caught between these different stakeholders putting pressure on us to move very quickly from knowledge to action, or focus too much on knowledge, because we also as researchers need to show publications for our if we want to have further funding. And so we are sometimes not all that free in selecting our roles. And I must say that one of my biggest frustrations was also is that most of the funders seem to have a very limited idea of what co-creation is. So this idea that you get a few stakeholders together who also then decide on the research agenda, and then that's, they co-formulate the questions, and that's what you're going to do. And that is actually quite a problematic process, as no doubt Tobias will also show, we'll discuss later on in this presentation. Can I have the next slide, please? And one of the complications, of course, but challenges, and also it also makes it great fun for researchers, is that we have to think about, what knowledge is relevant. How do we produce knowledge? What kind of knowledge? By whom? For whom? And I think in anthropology there is quite a long tradition on reflecting on how we do research. In ethnography, by being there, hanging out, talking to people. There is this idea that actually the anthropologist co-creates the knowledge with the people that you do research with. They also bring up questions that you have not thought of before you went to the field, as we refer to it in anthropology. And so they very much co-create the knowledge with you. But that, of course, is not the same as the co-creation that we use in this seminar, and the co-creation used for sustainability problems. And so if we have to work with different disciplines, these different disciplines often vary in terms of ideas about what knowledge is, how it should be collected, ideas about the validity of knowledge. Do you need a huge number of observations? Do you need contextualized knowledge or not? How do you deal with that? So it's already quite a challenge to connect different disciplines with different ontologies and epistemologies, different ways of doing science, different ways of thinking about how, what is out there and how can we study it. And then, adding the knowledge of practitioners, but also local and indigenous knowledge further complicates this process. And together with Maria Tengo and others, we wrote an article on how to do that without using one type of knowledge to validate the other, because that's part of the hero role archetype, is that there is this sort of dominant idea of this is knowledge, and so knowledge of local communities that sort of confirms scientific ideas is integrated, merged, and other knowledge is put aside as not relevant, is not valid. And so we came up with this idea of mobilizing different kinds of knowledges, also, of course, engaging in a process of translation. How do you translate knowledge between different kinds of knowledges, between different actors? Negotiate, because the knowledge is political. It is about making choices. It is about how do we see the future. And so this model sort of is an idea, presents an idea of weaving knowledge together rather than using one type of knowledge to validate the other types of knowledge. Can I have the next slide, please? So that is one part of, you know, bringing all these different types of knowledges together in these multi-stakeholder co-production processes. Takes a lot of time, and sometimes indeed projects do not move beyond that or do not have time to move beyond that. But it is also very important to address the politics of co-production of knowledge. And when we discussed before Josie's presentation what co-production is, we already mentioned that actually this idea of, you know, bringing people together, then co-defining the research agenda, and then doing the research, and then from there coming to policy recommendations, sort of skips a step, because you do need to have an insight into these local relations. And sometimes also over time, when you're doing the project, new stakeholders become visible, which were not visible when you started the project. And so it's very important to ask these questions. You know, who are the stakeholders? Do we miss people? What are processes of inclusion and exclusion among these different stakeholders, and including, you know, I add us scientists to the group of stakeholders, and so whose problem definitions are we working with or on, and whose knowledge do we include, but also who has access to decision-making processes and who doesn't. And one of my main messages here is that this complicates the process tremendously, but we need to stay with the trouble. We need to engage with conflicting problem definitions, conflicting solutions, because otherwise we do run the risk of sort of reinforcing the status quo and contributing to the further marginalization of already marginalized groups. Can I have the next slide, please? And sometimes, so I want to briefly present two cases. One, this is actually, it's a project I was engaged with, which actually is a failed attempt at co-production. I must admit, but I think we also learn from failures. And it also shows, because I forgot to say that, tell that with the, share that message with the last slide, is that we need to stay with the trouble. But of course, we as researchers also have, when we want to include certain groups in our research or in the co-creation processes, that can be a very political decision as well. And it does say something about how we define the problem. And so this problem definition is already a very political process. And these slides relate to, or these pictures relate to a project I conducted together with colleagues in South Africa, and with African and European PhD students, master students. And we wanted to study the socioeconomic impacts of shifts from conventional farming in South Africa to so-called game farming. So places where you can watch game or hunt game, and which rely a lot on tourism. And these shifts towards game farming were supposed to contribute both to biodiversity conservation through the creation of the expansion of wildlife habitats, which is very relevant in the light of the recent agreement in Montreal. And they were also supposed to contribute to local economic development through tourism development. And this tourism development would then create jobs for the poor people in South African countryside. And we wanted to know, and that formulation of that overall goal of that project was already turned out to be quite a political choice. We wanted to know what the impacts of these conversions were on mainly non-white farm workers. And what's particular about this group is that these farms where they used to work, they were not only the workplaces, but they were also their homes. They often lived on farms or had access to land for cultivation. And that in turn allowed farmers, most of them white, allowed them to pay lower wages. And so we presented our research plan to game farmers, and they have their own lobby organization, and they have provincial organizations as well. And so we discussed the research plans, and they were very enthusiastic. They were convinced that our research would confirm their win-win narrative, good for conservation and good for local development. And yes, we should go ahead with this research, and they would cooperate with us. But when we proposed to also invite rural development organizations representing farm workers, many of them objected, saying that there was no need to involve them, let alone the farm workers themselves, to which we did not have access at that time. As you know, the lobby organization could provide us with all the right data about economic revenues, and then we were supposed to just assume the trickle-down effect and calculate numbers of jobs on the basis of what they provided and the data they provided us with. And farm workers were not considered to be knowledgeable on the wildlife industry and its impact on development. And we actually struggled to have game farmers, the farm workers themselves involved in the research, because we could only access them on farm if we had permission from landowners. So we also tried to connect with them off farm in the townships where they were visiting relatives, or where many of them were relocated to. And so with the team, we conducted about 300 interviews with game farmers, farm workers, government officials, land rights and labor activists. And we conducted in-depth ethnographies on 11 game farms in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And actually, one of our findings was that in most of these cases, farm conversions resulted in the actual loss of employment opportunities. And that had to do with the fact that most of these game farms sort of were created by amalgamating multiple farms. So farm owners either over time bought out their neighbors, or they got the help of investors. And pooling the land to create some viable habitat for wildlife, for tourists. It must be said that the contributions to biodiversity conservation were not all that straightforward either, because they, first of all, in order to claim the wildlife, they had to fence their properties, and even if some of them were really large, like 30,000 hectares, that was not big enough for, you know, viable wildlife population. So they always had to be fed, they had to be managed. Plus, game farmers were stocking species that were popular with tourists and not necessarily adapted to the kind of habitat or the area they were in. But this amalgamation of farms made it actually quite possible for game farmers to evict farm workers who were protected by legislation that allowed farm workers to claim their homes on farms if they could prove they'd been living there for a number of years. And with the amalgamation, farmers would register it with the Ministry of Tourism to get the permits to hunt or to keep predators, but they would not register the amalgamation with the Department of Land or with the cadastre. And so by moving farm workers who used to be scattered all over the property to keep an eye on crops or livestock, saying, well, you have to move to the edges because we're creating pristine nature for tourists. And so by moving them to the edges of the game farm, on paper, they had moved to a different farm, and so they could no longer claim the land. Plus, if you looked at how many people had been working on all these different farms that went into this one game farm, we found that in most cases, not in all, but in most cases, there's actually a loss of job opportunities. And of course, when we started this program, we knew very well that, you know, the deep inequalities in terms of access to land, access to policy making, which are legacies of the colonial and apartheid era, we knew we could not change that with a research project. But we had hoped that we could bring, and we did that throughout the project, so not just at the end, but that we could bring together, you know, various actors to put at least the agenda of these farm workers, to put the farm workers on the agenda. And in one province where we tried this, we tried to prepare farm workers in separate workshops so that they would be feel more empowered to speak at the multi-stakeholder workshops. So it's also important to engage, we thought, with some of the stakeholders that are more marginalized outside of these multi-stakeholder interactions. But even then, it was very, very difficult for them to speak out, confronted with game farmers and game farmers associations especially did not want to listen, that just kept repeating, but it is, your figures are wrong, this is creating more jobs. And also policymakers who have no idea how to tackle the huge unemployment figures and just want to believe in these myths. And also did not want to respond to that. So over time, every now and then we are still contacted by policymakers who say, oh, but this wasn't win-win, can you explain? In one province where there were a lot of very, very violent conflicts between farm workers and farm owners, strangely enough, that made the relations at these workshops a bit more equal, and people were more prepared to listen to one another. And we've described that in a paper in Ecology and Society. And so they did look at, well, actually, you know, it's the market that is driving this. Actually, it's the state that is not protecting family farms and farm workers. And so there were, you know, activist organizations and wildlife management organizations found a common way of talking, of indeed defining the problem, and cooperations were started. Unfortunately, funding for our project ran out, so we were not able to follow up, but we have kept in touch with the local organizations that have done that. I don't know how much time do I have, Gilles?
I'm not exactly sure either, but perhaps we can move on to your last slide.
Last slide, because this was as I said, you know, sometimes, so we were more or less forced to become the woodpecker. We tried to be the host, but we were forced, or not, yeah, sort of accommodate the different perspectives, and try to also create an understanding for these different perspectives, and from there move to solutions. We managed to do a little bit of that in one of the provinces and not in the other. This is a picture of a project that is not mine. It's actually Hendrik Enson and Bridget Pitt. They worked in the Cape Flats, which is a township in Cape Town, a dumping ground for people. It's a flood area. It's a dune area. And but this one of the neighborhoods borders on a wetland, the Princess Vlei, and that wetland sort of borders on the colored community of the Cape Flats and a white community. And this wetland was always very important for local people because it was the only sort of outdoor nature space they had access to. Most of the nearby beaches during apartheid were whites only. And so this became a place where people organized brides, where they went swimming, where they try to recuperate a bit in nature. And then in 2009, there was this idea of a property developer came in and wanted to build a big mall, big parking spaces. And it must be said that in the 1980s and 1990s, this area had become increasingly unsafe, and people used the wetland less and less because gangs had taken over the neighborhood. But when this developer came in and proposed to just pave over the whole thing, and of course, again, promising jobs, there was a local activist group that opposed this mall. And after a long process, actually won in 2014. And this valley, sort of the activities, the activists sort of created this nice story about the valley, because the Princess Vlei, the Princess Valley, was linked to a local story about a Khoi princess who was abducted by, the first sailors coming in South Africa, kept a prisoner in a cave, and then her tears flowed down the mountain and created this wetland. And there was this, together with the protest against the mall, there was this all these activities geared towards dressing the princess again, because the area had also been environmentally very much destroyed. And so there was this attempt to dress the princess again by restoring especially indigenous vegetation. And what was interesting was that in this project, it was a sort of a coalition of white-based environmental groups, middle-class colored ratepayers organization that had strong links with the anti-apartheid movement, trade unions, and they tried to make sense of this project and also try to define what the aims were. And when the developer came in, there were some divisions, because some people said, well, if we have this shopping mall, we also have security, all these security guards at the shopping mall. The shopping mall will provide jobs. And others said, no, this is our space. We need to reclaim it. And so local rappers, artists also mobilized the narrative of the princess, also mobilized the schools, so schools could adopt a plot and then work towards the restoration of indigenous vegetation, fynbos. There were also some frictions between conservationist and local activist groups, because the conservationists wanted to get rid of all the alien species around the wetland, including the eucalyptus. But that would mean that there was no shade at all, and so that people wouldn't be able to organize their brides and their swims. And so there was a little bit of compromising on that, as long as the clothing of the dressing of the princess further upstream towards the source was done. So this was and I think this is an important thing to mention, just as Josie did in her presentation. I think we need to work more together with artists, architects, because here again, it was artists that sort of shaped this story, created this story that mobilized all these different actors. And so in the end, people managed to stall the mall, stop the plans for the mall. A lot of restoration has been going on, but with some compromises around the lake in the township. And so this could be presented, but maybe Hendrik is a bit more critical. But sorry, but this could be presented as more sort of a project where the frictions were dealt with, were incorporated in the project, and led to an outcome that did satisfy several stakeholders, but did do justice to the most marginalized stakeholders. So thank you very much for your attention. Try to do two cases in one presentation, but
Thank you very much, Marja. No, it was really interesting to hear this those descriptions of the intricacies, the complexities of co-production in context. Thanks. Are there any questions for Marja? I don't see any questions in the chat, and we're running a little bit behind schedule. So perhaps we can move to the last presentation for this session with Tobias Haller. Whenever you're ready, Tobias.
Yeah, I will share my screen in a minute. But I think it's what it was interesting also by Maria's presentation was that there was an external threat to the whole thing in the last case, who sort of led to many processes. So I think also in our analysis, we should not forget the external pressures, also the capitalist market who creates, we talked about meaning, about valuation. I mean, suddenly an era is valued from the outside by powerful actors where you don't have a say locally. And then that might trigger, I mean, it's a drama, you either lose or you create more power locally in order to establish an alternative. And that's a bit something I would like to talk about. I will share my screen. We will remain in floodplain areas. I chose to present a case that I've been working on for quite some time in Zambia, in the Kafue Flats. This was part of a larger comparative project where we compared several floodplains in Africa regarding the management and governance of what is called commons. I mean, common pool resources, pasture, wildlife, fisheries, etc. And as I mentioned also, and as we have heard from Josie and also from Maria, the idea of this co-creation was somehow there, but in the first place, it was a classical research project, an interdisciplinary research project where we had to engage also with natural scientists. And actually, this co-creation just came later on, and I would like to illustrate with this case sort of what happened, and this led actually to this concept which we call constitutionality. I mean, the word constitutionality exists already, but it refers here regarding a local sense of ownership in bottom-up institution building processes. I mean, rules and regulations, the co-production of rules and regulations by local people and with assistance or co-creating elements from researchers, which is at stake. So the place we will be talking about is the Kafue Flats in Zambia. I will go into details later on, but let me just show some issues and approaches. It is clear that there's this debate that we need local involvement in common pool resource management, controlled by states. But the challenge, as we have seen already also in previous presentations, is the heterogeneity of interest and the lack of power relations analysis. I mean, to see what's really happening on the ground is a really tricky thing. And if that is not seen and that is not perceived, we heard it with Maria, with these workers, Josie has a lot of cases where this analysis is central, and that takes quite some time. There's a critical analysis of participatory approaches also from political ecology people, meaning that there's now, since a couple of years, more than 20 years, they're saying, well, research and also project need to participatory. So already in 2001, Cook and Kothari said it's participation the new tyranny. I mean, you need to participate. Piers Blakey wrote a paper in 2006 calling the community-based natural resource management as a Trojan horse, actually claiming participation, but actually as the more powerful people claim for that participation, it is via the idea of participation, sneaking into a local context and controlling it. To the outside, you can say it has been participatory. So it's one thing of this critique. We had a lot of work going on protected areas, on cross-sectional commons, and also the African floodplain project, which I showed, but there are also quite a lot of protected areas there, state control, and projects that claim to be participatory. And we realized most of them failed because First of all, there was a divergence of understanding what local participation, what this means between local people, local actors, and NGOs and governments. Secondly, this is a bit an economic aspect. I'm also an economic anthropologist. It was clear, there was said participation would lead to win-win-win solutions. But if you economically analyzed many of the cases, we had 40 and 50 cases, which we had a look at all over Africa specifically, but also globally. There was actually no gain. If people were participating, they were not getting not even a fraction of what they lost of land, of access to resources, specifically Kampu resources, pasture, wildlife, and fisheries, etc. In some cases also in Zambia, where I was we'll be talking about, people are supposed to participate by gaining $1 per year. I mean, you really think, well, this cannot be, but it was sold as being a participatory wildlife co-management scheme. So that was not working. And amicably, from a local perspective seen, it was often negative. Often it was no devolution of power. Most of these areas where we are working and had a look at were actually, before colonial times, in one way or the other, a communal property, and not just the land, but also the land-related resources in order sort of to manage them. People had developed rules and regulations, and these were undermined during colonial times. And if participatory means were set up, there were what Potiti and Rivo called repertoires of domination, so several rules. Like, you know, there are some conservation rules, or there is a rule regarding giving back some of the land, etc. So the whole institutional framework was still like as, yeah, you can participate in the sense of on what we dictate, but you cannot have the ownership and you cannot actually decide on the rules of the game. So that leads to the next point. In all these cases, imposed design of participation, no consideration of local power structure. Often local elites found many of these projects great because they were getting some goodies, some money, some cars, I don't know what, some recognition, some money to distribute. So that was welcome, but not by everybody, but often mainly also by elites. But later on, it could be seen as being participatory. And last but not least, often no trust in the state due to also this aspect that there's a huge chaos of legal sort of settings nowadays. You don't have only local rules and regulations, which partly have been undermined in many of these cases where we studied, but also, I mean, the state is a huge heterogeneity system, you know, where you have often conflicting rules and regulations, meaning on the one side, rules and regulation regarding construction, regarding investment, on the other side regarding conservation, etc. So, and then veterinary service rules, and then also gender rules and regulations. So a huge chaos where actually also the powerful sort of selected among the rules which was in their interest. So what we call institution shopping. But actually also in many cases, the state not really being present, meaning if it was about resource governance on a local context regarding fisheries or wildlife or pasture use, etc. The state was often not there, but claimed ownership of that resources and also the governance. But the state didn't have the financial means actually to manage the resources. So on the one hand, the state was absent, but on the other hand, the state was present in the sense that the property was still in the hands of the state. And that created a lot of conflictive situations, which I will also show them from a case study. The problem is really participation only in the management. Is this a solution? And what we saw in many of the cases also related to protected areas and resource governance is this ideology of pure nature. Maria also mentioned this. The idea that these areas where projects are to be realized actually have never been used by local people, etc. These are not actually shaped by local people, but it's nature that is on the thread. And this often combined with a development discourse. So no real ownership rights over the resources, because, and I think that's important also regarding this historical transformation. If we come into a context, we need to know more about the history. And in many cases, it's this sort of institutional change from common property constellations to state property, privatization, or as you will see later on, also de facto open access because the state cannot manage it. And as I said, low income generated and received So distributional problems, high costs remain. So local people should participate, should patrol, should help, etc. But actually no real incentive and no dynamic management of what actually is not a pure nature area, but a cultural landscape that has been managed for a long time by local people on pre-colonial times. So constitutionality as a concept looks at, are there stories that went differently in all these chaos, and refers to institution building processes in rare cases of successful bottom-up resource governance initiatives. It is about interested in local views, why participation in the development of institutions sort of happen, and defining important elements of cases which were really sort of working out, where this bottom-up institution building was taking place. The starting point was actually Foucault's notion of governmentality, and this was extended by Agarwal, naming it environmentality, making local people as environmental subjects by the state. But there's a problem and a critique there, as Agarwal does not really look at the asymmetric power of relationship and heterogeneous interests of actors. So he uses the case in India, where actually people were violently against rules and regulations from the colonial British state regarding forestry. But then when the Indian state sort of took over and said, we need to protect the forests, etc., Agarwal claims that local people suddenly also became conservationists. But what he did not realize is that as timber was getting scarce, local people used actually the rules of the state in order to sort of prohibit other local actors from using actually the timber. And in that way, actually, it was not environmentality, so that they embodied the state rules of regulations, but more strategic use of this. So what we propose is another thing. Constitutionality would then, as a contrast, be a conscious bottom-up institution building process where a sense of ownership of this locally created rules and regulations is actually happening under condition of asymmetric local power context, and also external and internal power differences. So that later rules and regulations are seen as mine or our rules in a broader constitutional sense. And the concept is based on empirical cases from different areas, from Zambia and also other areas. We have a paper that was published in 2016, but later papers as well. I can send you then some information. Also, we did some work in Switzerland and in the US. And in all cases, conflicts in research teams and within and between communities actually could be shown. I want very quickly, if time permits, go into one of these cases in order to illustrate what we mean. Myself, I did research in the Kafue Flats. This is a floodplain in central Zambia. Zambia is a state close to Tanzania, bordering also Botswana. And there, it's a floodplain that was once actually characterized in literature as the land of milk and honey, because when the area is flooded and the water recedes, you have very nice ponds where you can fish. You have nice pastures, you have wildlife moving up and down. And actually that had been the common property of local agropastoralists and fishery and hunting populations who were, that was part of our research, actually setting up a whole regulation and institutional setting that was adapted to the flooding pattern. There was this notion of territory belonging to someone, but not just belonging to a local group, but also spiritual beings, ancestors are the co-owners of that group. And that's a different ontology, which was important. You see here pictures from a collective fishing context when the water recedes. In order to coordinate this, people were giving a date when to gather close to a pond where fish were being trapped after the flood recedes, because fish were moving out of the river and then moving back again. As a matter of fact, also crocodiles and other animals moved back and forth there. So people were giving a date where a ritual would be performed for the ancestral spirits in order to permit people to fish, and that was actually in relation with the local leader and the spiritual leader as well. You see below, the spiritual leader does a ritual in order to appease ancestral spirits so that everybody can go in. And then you see on the picture on the top right, women who then go fishing with baskets, swim with spears, everything nicely sort of organized. So really well adapted. Actually, people also did this because the whole area was monitored before these fishing events. And also people believed if the ritual is not done, ancestor spirits would be angry and would attack people via crocodiles. So you see there's this notion of a different ontology inbuilt in this institutional setting, which you need to understand before you can understand actually these institutions. And as a matter of fact, these ritual masters did some coordination regarding the use and the management. It was not about sustainability, but the leader who was actually organizing this whole event together with the ritual master, he got a lot of prestige when the fishery was good, when there was a very good event. So there were big men attracting followers. Other groups could as well be invited. So it was a well-balanced thing. And obviously it worked, because when the British came to colonize the area, there was still plenty fish there, also wildlife and other resources. So what happened there? There was a huge institutional change then in colonial and post-colonial time, as the state took over actually the fishery and transformed it into a state property. And for commercial reasons, also because copper was found, copper cities were being built, protein was needed. So the colonial administration wanted to exploit this area to bring fish to the area. And the state also set up some rules and regulation, but did not recognize these local sort of management. So in the 1975, Zambia became independent. It was Northern Rhodesia before. Zambia financed itself via copper sales, but then there was a crisis. Copper had low prices, and then suddenly the state didn't have the money. So they could actually not monitor the area as they did before. And also a lot of mining people lost jobs and went into fishery. So you see on the picture here, actually these were fishing partially with mosquito nets or fine mesh nets, taking actually all the fish out, and this led to a fishery crisis. Huge seasonal camps developed in the middle of this floodplain, taking out a lot of fisheries. So people were really sort of lacking fish. And the interesting thing was that this was actually a de facto open access, because neither local rules nor the state rules were sort of operating, leading to a massive decline of stock in the area, and also to problems of nutrition. Interestingly here, this issue of the state being present and absent sort of was part of the whole thing, because actually the state could not monitor. They didn't have money to control the area, no transportation, etc. But the people coming from outside said, well, we are citizens of the state, so this is our resource, so we can sort of use it. And to the locals who said, well, you shouldn't fish like this, they said, you're not from the state, you're not the government, so don't tell us how to fish. In order to mitigate also problems of not getting access to fish, women went to the fishing camps, prostituted themselves in order to get fish. And then you had a whole issue regarding also health. HIV was spreading, and there were a lot of conflicts also in these fishing camps. So it was a huge disaster actually developing from a well-regulated constellation. And now the co-creation part comes in. That was part of our research. And when we finished that research, the local research assistants came to us and said, well, what's in it now for us? We understand now the situation, also because we were co-creating knowledge on the problem. So what are we doing now? You're going home, you're writing your work, but we would like to do something. And then the issue was then that we were out of these conflicts also in touch with local fishery departments. And we realized that there's the option in Zambia to create bylaws to the fishery laws. And what we did then together with our research assistant and together with other NGOs, we said, okay, let's discuss with different local interest groups, because we got to know them. Also, they had different powers, you know, people around the local chief, for instance, people around an opposition leader, women's groups, also the commercial fishermen, etc. And according to these different groups whom we know, we were asking them, would you be interested amongst yourself to discuss in a way of carte blanche the option of creating bylaws to the fishery law? So how would you frame it if you had a say? And that had the opportunity of, you know, not bringing everybody together, because you had huge power differences, because some people would not like to speak to the chief because he was seen as a crook. Others didn't want to speak to the opposition leader, etc. Women were not able to speak up in certain villages which were marginal, couldn't have a say, etc. So we knew all this, and to cut the story short, not just the chief, but many different user groups, men and women, separately were sort of discussing and setting up their own rules and regulations, and our research assistants help them to put this down, to write this down. And then later on, we provided a platform where this was pooled and this was discussed. So this was a bottom-up process. And the interesting thing is that everybody had this idea, this is also my rule, and paying attention to these local sort of the developments. So the process or the results were these bylaws accepted by all included, interestingly, pre-colonial collective fishery institutions adapted to the flooding pattern. The picture which you saw regarding the ponds and also in the river. So some people said we need to re-govern these common pool resources, and we had good rules. So some of them should be part of it. Also discussion of gear, men and women separately, and also gear coming from outside in order to control the whole situation. But that was not the whole issue, because there were other issues which were brought in. For instance, poverty reduction, access to fish for local people. There was a closing time which did not make sense based on local knowledge. So people still wanted to have access to some of the fish during the closing time, but then knowing where the fish were breeding so that these would be then protected. Then also law and order at this campsite. In the afternoon, it's like a gold rush situation. People, men mainly were drunk, etc. It was really very difficult. So people wanted to control these areas. So the bylaws would also include law and order. Then also co-management. We had discussions with the fishery department, and people say, look, sometimes we need you to come in to help us set up things. It's not that we are against the state, but you have to assist us. But we want to have a say in the rulemaking. So they wanted to have this co-creation also with state people, and they were complaining that the fishery department did not show up. And then last but not least, health issues regarding this HIV thing, fish for sex deals between local women and commercial fishermen in the camps, issues of sanitation. So there was a lot of combination of things, and these bylaws were then sort of set up. So a combination of old rules, new innovations, and the success was that initially the fishermen tend to stand away or adapt to the new rules, but there was little support by the higher level staff of the fishery department, because they said, oh, a project is coming in, we don't profit from it. So we didn't make our homework also to include them as much as we should, and there was a slow ratification process. But in the first couple of years, some of the fish species came back, fish became bigger, people were very happy, but we failed also because a local NGO took the process out of our hands of the researchers and did not push the ratification process, which was a problem. But there's a potential actually, and that illustrates this constitutionality. Finally, we are crafting our own rules. So people were coming from far away, walking actually to come to meetings because they had this interest, because it was also their rules and regulation. And high interest in implementation was also there. So compared with other cases, we have a lot of other cases. I can share the paper. We came to 6 aspects, and I think it's more this sort of host archetype. I would say, Josie, perhaps you can come in later on. We saw in this chaos, it was clear that there must be an endemic perception of a need of new rules and regulations, that people are aware that something has to happen. And also because, like in Maria's case, this external value of the floodplain that changed, that actually made people also react. Then a participatory process which addressed power asymmetries. Just going together with local chiefs would not have worked, because there were 50% of the people were opposing the chiefs due to several also historical colonial reasons. Chiefs were installed in colonial times, so people were not trusting them at all, a part of them. Then pre-existing institutions, and their research was important. We needed to know what people are doing, and the rules and regulations also related to local knowledge, as we see below. And what we did actually, we were just a catalyzing agent, a fair platform. We were mediating. I mean, people said, well, can you do something? But in the sense of people, after all the time that you've been here doing research, we trust you. You're neither with the state, nor are you with the local chief, nor are you with this actor. So we trust that you sort of try to bring everything together, and also having discussions separately and then pooling those helped a lot, because everybody's had the idea, I'm also in there. And also then recognizing local knowledge, creativity, and social learning. I mean, engaging between these groups, and also paying attention that people are knowledgeable, for instance, about fisheries, about how the fish should be managed. That was really important also for their identity, that they're knowledgeable. That was an important part. And then higher level state recognition. Yes, and that's the tricky part of it all. I mean, Maria also talked about, and I think Josie, you also have many cases when this is not working, things get messy and difficult. It's messy already, but this is a very important point and needs to be addressed. And sometimes it's working, sometimes not. So actually, what one could call that this is a tragedy of the grabbed commons, but I would rather say it's a drama of the grabbed commons, because you need to see that there's a process going on and you never know in which direction it will be going. So even if the state is not picking up, and the state is also heterogeneous, it's still worthwhile if there is activity also on the local ground to participate. Perhaps a final word. We were together with actually also natural scientists in this field. We had a huge discussion whether we should be engaging or not, whether we should be involved or not. Also, what is data? So there's also a huge interdisciplinary sort of problematic issue which is there, which needs to be addressed. But actually, finally, it was an interesting process which we continue to follow up. And there's several cases which we have summarized in several papers. And these is a bit a type of finding which we have from all these cases. So thank you very much for your attention. I will then put in the chat 2 papers which are open access and to be downloaded if you're interested in this project. And actually part of this is also in the paper co-written together with Josie and also with Maria. So also there, this co-creation went into further co-creation processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. Now, do we have questions based on Tobias' presentation? Yes, Eva, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting and insightful. I have a question about the perception and acceptance of bottom-up institution building processes, because I can imagine that they can be perceived as quite threatening by decision makers who are currently in power. Because, like, yeah, just by definition, people who are in power in the current system, did quite well in the past. Mm-hmm. So I could imagine that this results in lacking willingness to just do something about it or change the status quo. And I wanted to ask if you thought about strategies, how you can push for change towards acknowledging this value you presented and the importance as well of bottom-up processes, and also the importance of creating space for it.
Exactly. I mean, it meant first, as I said at the beginning of this meeting, it means research. You need to know, who is who, what is happening also historically. And then the process was actually not pursued in the sense of, okay, the chief or the chiefs are crooks, let's leave them aside. We also said, well, are you interested also, or what's your view on how fisheries should be managed? So they were part of the whole thing. And then when they understood the others were also participating, there was this interest of not standing aside, and of course also of not losing position. And in addition, there were so many conflicts around the fisheries that the chiefs who were to the outside also seen as being the responsible person to handle these conflicts, there was this interest. So we also, when we approached then these chiefs, etc., we sort of tried to capture their interest in the thing. But the thing was not to just hand it over just to them, to make the mistake of say, well, if a local chief is in, then the whole people are in, And that was very important, because this issue of heterogeneity is a central aspect. And but then again, to sort of foster an equal platform was an important thing, and the trust people had in us that we are not taking sides. So I don't know, Josie, if that corresponds to the host sort of archetype, or
yeah, I think it does, but it is, and good to see you, Eva. But it is an issue, and we had it. It's sometimes, you know, governments also and policymakers are not one homogeneous body either. So sometimes you can find someone who's sympathetic and who manages to mobilize people in these institutions. But I think also in the case of South Africa, and the game farming, this this idea of the market as the solution has been really, you know, drilled in people also by I mean, at the turn of when apartheid was abolished, there was a fear that, you know, the ANC would nationalize companies, and so they were really subjected to, you know, crash courses in neoliberalism. And so this idea of the market as the solution is very, very dominant and very, very difficult to challenge. And I think in this case, you know, policymakers are really, they don't know how to deal with these staggering unemployment figures. And so when people come along and say, oh, hey, we have the solution, win-win, you know, it's very difficult for them to give up that narrative. But we also had a glimpse of how, you know, the exclusion works, because one of the PhD students did an ethnography of the Wildlife Policy Forum, which was a forum which was established by government to sort of try and harmonize legislation between, you know, Ministry of Land and Agriculture, Ministry of Environment, and so they had invited stakeholders, and then there was a request from the Ministry of Labor to join that forum, because they felt that, you know, labor legislation on farms and on game farms would matter too. And the wildlife lobby, and this was before, because the current president is a game farmer, but this was before the current president. But they managed to convince government that no, the labor is something else. It's not related to game farming. And so that also meant, you know, the exclusion of people who were working to represent farm dweller interest. And so it was so it was really focused on wildlife. What do people know about wildlife? But that was a very deliberate and very political choice. But that also needs to be seen in this context. So what means do countries have to do things? You know, what's the bigger political context? And also in our discussions, I mean, we had some online discussions on the meeting in Montreal, and then people kept bringing up, oh, but we need to find a market solution. It's a really dominant narrative.
This is why I'm pushing the institutional element and institutions regarding these rules and regulations, because in this sort of heterogeneity power constellation also of the market, and in this win-win constellation, I mean, markets are not free. We know this. They're also ruled by rules and regulations, etc. And my major point is that as we're not able to address also the property issues of resources, meaning also the commons. I mean, this alternative way of co-owning and also shaping rules and regulations. You know, people never said in Zambia that these external fishermen should keep out completely, but they should. They are allowed to come in, but they should actually fish the way collectively it was decided. They can do this, you know. And it's also how shall I put it, conflict mitigation issues, and it's a sharing and caring issue. So the market promises, profit for everybody, but as we know, it's only the powerful who profit from the market because they can push things aside, and also powerful market actors can select regarding rules and regulations. I mean, these external fishermen, they were selecting this rule that they're citizens of the state. So they have the right, because it's a state resource, they have the right to use it and undermined local rights actually to have a say. And the constitutionality process in the bylaw crafting was actually a first step in actually stopping this, which was also about the fair distribution of resource. and having a say, and not just the powerful having a say. But of course, regarding these government actors, which are very heterogeneous, that also needs research. You need to know who is there, who is acting, who has which type of stake, you know, and that needs to be part of the whole negotiation and situation. But I think as a strategy to co-create rules and regulations, for me, I understood that this is also what the heterogeneity of local people want. They want to have clarity. What are the rules of the game?
Maybe also to add to that, and also bridge to a question that I saw pop up in the chat around combining kind of more bottom up and top down approaches, because I think all of the cases were really interesting because kind of the history of co-production has often developed in a way to be increasingly more attentive to power relations at a local scale, and a lot of the cases engaged locally. And I think all of the cases, so Marja's case, Tobias's case, and many others show that there are often these figures of power that are either very difficult to deal, that are brought inside of the co-production process, or kind of remain outside of it, but are very crucial to, for example, ratifying bylaws. And so I think that's something that was a really interesting collective reflection, was the importance of thinking about what are in kind of novel or interesting co-production strategies for engaging with those key actors. So what could have been done, for example, with the Department of Fisheries in Tobias's case, and in Marja's case? Is there an alternative way of engaging with the game farmers up front, or by creating more kind of pressure in other ways that would really kind of attend more specifically to that power dimension that can so often come into co-opt processes? And it was interesting because when we did a cluster analysis of all of these cases, there were two that were more oriented towards working with powerful actors in reframing ways. And it was such a small cluster that we almost couldn't like legitimize having that be a cluster, but it also showed that we really need to do more of that kind of work. And one of those is working with some of the largest CEOs in the fishery industry across the world and creating space for reflection. And I mean, they did all sorts of interesting things, like have the CEOs be barefoot during meetings, like different things to kind of put them out of their comfort zone and foreground certain types of values, and not just have the normal kind of engagement that's trying to either speak the win-win language just to get them on board, but they continue thinking, oh, this is going to prove or already fulfill my existing interests. Because I guess I see that as the biggest challenge, is getting kind of almost them out of the mindset of wanting to just use this co-production process to further their existing interests, and really foregrounding an interest in change and transformation upfront as kind of a legitimate mandate for why they're involved and why people are together.
But access is a real issue here, because somehow, you know, we manage to enforce ourselves on communities. We just go there, and somehow, you know, doesn't mean that local communities cannot resist research projects. They can, and they can also derail them. But with these powerful actors, access is a real issue, and the ones that give you access are often the ones that indeed, you know, either think they can greenwash their image, or they are interested in real change. So there's a lot, and we, in a project in Kenya that we did on land conflicts involving private sector actors, we noted that, you know, for some land conflicts, it works to generate publicity about this in sort of the home countries of these companies, because they are, you know, because they have a local constituency that can respond to damaged reputations. And in other cases, companies are completely out of reach. You know, you can campaign, you can, but also because locally there is not, you know, people are not in a position to sort of respond to what their companies are doing abroad. But I do think we need to explore more of these avenues, and maybe we should become a bit more activist.
Controversial, but necessary question. I see that we have a question from Florencia. I don't know if you still...
Yes, thank you. In relation to this same subject, because I fully agree with what Marjorie was stating, but also Tobias mentioned that it's really important. I'm sorry, maybe I'm not quoting correctly, but you mentioned something like it's important for people to know that we are not taking a specific part. However, both from the case studies that you presented and also from my own experience that limits only to South America co-production projects, I've found that it's actually really relevant. I mean, people are constantly demanding us to position, and that really, I wouldn't say determined, but that really influences as, as Josie was mentioning, that really influences like the path that the co-production process may take or not. Just I can't help reflecting on that. Like, even though, considering that we are completely influenced by power relationships, we just can't help it. We are in them whether we like it or not, because when it comes to the co-production process itself, we can't help being read either as a white South American scholar or as a European. And in this sense, I would also like to add another dimension to the reflection, which is the fact that when it comes to trust building, the importance that the history has. I mean, all the three presentations have underlined it, and particularly the two last ones, which I think is really important, the relevance that colonial history has. And this is something that it's the first time that I have seen emphasized. So I would like to thank you, because I think this is crucial. And it's something that it's also like erased from both from the proposals or at least on the main showing cases spaces for co-production. Is something that it doesn't really, it's not mentioned enough. And just one last reflection, I would like to thank for this space, because generally when it comes to co-productions, there's so little room for social sciences. So really thank you for creating this space.
Thank you for this reaction.
May I quickly respond, because I have to leave later on. I'm really sorry. I have to take an exam because time is over. But very quickly to your question. What I meant by this neutral platform was, of course, we have certain power. We also ascribed power positions, but in this context, it was clear that we were seen as not having an extreme stake in the fisheries. You know, sort of actually giving the voice to someone and not to someone else. We were that was part of the research process, which was also quite conflictive, where we had different roles, but our role changed through the process. And then we had this role without actually wanting it developed like this, and also by asking different interest groups, because we knew that they were to have carte blanche, meaning that they could say what they would like to do. And then also this included also, of course, the chief, but also all the others. And that created a more neutral, I would say, more a neutral space of the whole thing. So making sure that everybody can have a say. So that led to this idea, okay, if I speak up and the chief is there, it won't be recognized. But I've been asked by these researchers, so in a local group, I sit down, we discuss locally what we want, and then we write this down, and this is on equal footing proposed then at the negotiation table. And that was something that was perceived. So that was the interesting thing. And to Maria's point also, I think we need to do similar research bottom up, which is even more difficult. But there are some people doing this now, and I think there is also co-creation needed. We can't do everything. I mean, I can't do research on the upper level, but perhaps we need to combine research within administration, within different groups, within companies, in order actually to have this knowledge, what's going on there, and also to see, are there actors with whom we could collaborate in this, you know. But perhaps not the same person can do this. So we also need to think about this collaboration.
Thanks, Tobias. I'd like to take a final question from Fanon, who's has had this hand raised for quite some time now. Shannon, go ahead.
Shannon is struggling with the technology, I think. Maybe you can, otherwise you can put your question in the chat.
Shannon, do you still want to ask your question?
There's in the chat also this question regarding how not to reinforce the local power dynamics. This is exactly...
That was the question by Mulako Kabisa.
Yeah, that is exactly what constitutionality addresses, you know, that you don't reinforce this power sort of structure, but it needs to be this co-creative bottom-up process where you need to have the knowledge first and also link to colonial, to the knowledge what colonial times has changed, because these chiefs are a colonial product, for instance, you know. So you need to know this, you need to anticipate this. And of course, it's not perfect, but it's out of the many, many projects which we have analyzed, it was one of the few who actually tackled this power imbalance. And
yeah, I agree with you. And I think what we really need to pay attention to is the diversity within. So we often talk about the diversity between groups, but we should just as much focus on the diversity within.
Exactly. That's the whole point about this approach. And I think in the paper also of Josie, this is also well recognized that we need to address this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks for these last comments. Just to be mindful of the fact that we're already running over, we're going to have to conclude this meeting, even though there's probably, there's definitely lots and lots more we could say about co-production. And this has been a fascinating session. Thank you to everyone. Special thanks to our speakers, Josie, Marja, and Tobias, and to all the participants who contributed with their questions and comments to the discussion. And before we parted, I wanted to emphasize that once again that the Pathways Forum is a space designed for researchers, but also as much as possible designed by researchers. So I would like to encourage you to contact us or make suggestions in the chat now. If you have topics you would like to explore in the context of another Pathways Forum in the future. This is always something that is interesting for us to know and a pleasure to share with you all. And this has been raised a couple times during the session, but if you would like to watch the recording of this session later, this will be available on the Pathways webpage alongside all the other Pathways forums that we have already recorded in the past. And lastly, I also wanted to say that if you would like to stay informed of the Pathways Initiative activities, or want to hear about other opportunities related to Pathways approaches, transdisciplinarity, sustainability science, you can subscribe to our Pathways Initiative newsletter or follow us on Twitter. And my colleague Rebecca is providing links to access all of these in the chat box. And with this, I want to conclude by thanking all of you once again, wishing you a happy holidays and end of year celebrations. And I hope to see all of you next year in the Pathways Forum or in a different context. But until then, take care.